In this segment, we will discuss two saints, one from the West, another from the East. As we meditate on the issues of leadership and civil authority, it is important that we look to those saints so intertwined with these systems. King Saint Edward the Confessor of England and King Saint Stephen the Great of Hungary will serve as our examples for good, pious Christian kings. Edward the Confessor took back the throne from an illegitimate pretender and ushered in an era of peace and almsgiving throughout England. In England, Saint Edward the Confessor was an admirable king and should serve as a role model for all future Christian leaders. When he took the throne in England from the Danish Harold, bastard son of Canute, Edward ushered in a reign of almost unbroken peace. He lacked prideful, personal ambition, having been raised in exile. Edward was not interested in the worldly goals of other monarchs, not seeing a reason to stake unnecessary claims. For this reason, Edward brought peace to his people, and alongside that peace, alms and the well-being of his people. Despite giving much of his wealth to the poor and the church, Edward's charity did not cause his government's budget to falter or collapse. Instead, Edward was able to both be generous and maintain his royal establishments without imposing any taxes. Yet Edward the Confessor was ready to wage war, if it was necessary, repelling the Welsh and aiding Malcolm III in an effort to reclaim his throne from the usurper Macbeth. We were reminded by this that war is at many times necessary, even if a leader seeks to keep the peace. There is just war and there is unjust war. Saint Edward still prevented other potential outbursts of bloodshed, being prudent and gentle with such affairs. Edward the Confessor had made a promise that if he were to rule England, he would go on a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter. Unfortunately, Edward was unable to go on this pilgrimage, as if he were to leave his people, the realm would fall apart. For the good of his people, and for the good of his nation, he took up another project for the faith, Westminster Abbey. What does this show us about Edward the Confessor? This saintly king, despite having made such a promise, understood that God had called him to be the civil authority. He realized that it would do much harm to his kingdom to go through with a promise made when he was in exile, not knowing anything about ruling a nation. Saint Edward was still able to put God first, though, and did this through the construction of Westminster Abbey. In Hungary, Saint Stephen the Great was not only an admirable king, but the first king of his nation. His father, Duke Giza, was brought into Christianity after marrying Adelaide, a Christian Pole. Stephen would end up marrying the sister of Henry II, the future Holy Roman Emperor. This marriage would bring Henry many German allies, and Stephen needed allies, as when the saint took the throne of his nation, unlike Edward, the bloodshed was not over, it was just only about to begin. The pagan dukes and nobles rejected their Christian ruler, launching a rebellion against him, killing Christians and burning the land. Yet Hungary would not fall back into its wicked pagan roots. Stephen gathered his troops, while his allies in Germany assembled men for the new king's cause. Under the banners of St. George and St. Martin, they marched to face the enemy. Even with support from the Germans, Stephen was still outnumbered. Yet the saint was a fierce warrior and tactician, proving himself on the battlefield when he bested his pagan foes. Slaying the revolt's leader, Copany, Stephen immediately gave thanks to God for his victory. A monastery was built in honor of St. Martin, where the pagans had been killed. This was the first of many monasteries and churches Stephen would help establish throughout Hungary, bringing its people out of the false, man-made religions of paganism and into the truth of Christianity. As Stephen worked with the church to convert his people, his pagan uncle, Prince of Transylvania, invaded. Defeating his heathen uncle easily, Stephen brought Transylvania under the Hungarian crown. Then another invasion came, this time from Bulgaria, so Stephen marched out to win another victory for his nation and God. Yet again, Stephen bested his foes, defending his nation from the Bulgarian chieftains and personally killing their leader. Yet the chieftains then asked for the king permission to peacefully cross the borders into Hungary, and Stephen, being charitable, granted their request. When the chieftains were making their way throughout Hungary, however, local bandits came, robbing and killing almost all of them. Stephen decided to make an example of the criminals, condemning them to death. They were hung in pairs along his kingdom's borders. We can learn much from King Saint Edward the Confessor and King Saint Stephen the Great. Stephen was both a king, a warrior, and a zealous convert. The pagans who revolted against his reign were enemies of Hungary's eternal salvation. They had martyred numerous missionaries and Christian nobles. They had put many faithful to the sword. Stephen, as the king of Hungary, had a duty and obligation to both his people and God to save his nation from this menace. That is what Stephen did. He brought just war to unjust enemies. These rebellious nobles would not convert. They would not listen to reason. And for that reason, they simply had to go. Edward the Confessor was a king of humble birth, having been raised in exile. His reign was one of peace and almsgiving. Edward's people already embraced the Christian faith, and yet he too had to deal with just wars in order to defend his people and his allies from unjust enemies. Devoting his rule to God and to the people of England, Edward shows us what a leader's focuses should be when there is no immediate threat to his nation. Stephen had many threats, internal and external, that had to be faced with military force. Edward, on the other hand, faced far less, and was able to solve many issues without bloodshed, allowing his rule to be very generous to the people, as it should be.